Okay, welcome to our September 2024 Abbeville Institute Zoom webinar. This is going to be a lot of fun because it's a little bit larger webinar than we normally have. Normally have one guest, but today we have three. So it's going to be a great time. And of course, we're talking about Reconstruction today, which is a huge topic. Of course, two of our presenters are probably going to mention that we're still under Reconstruction, so that'll be a lot of fun to talk about. But this is, of course, hosted by the Abbeville Institute. It is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. If you like what we do, our webinars, our conferences, our website, all the things that we have, our 1607 project, which is the newest thing, one of the newest things we just did, please consider a tax-deductible donation to the Institute. I, of course, am Brian McClanahan, the president of the Institute. And so we're very happy to have you on board with this. This is being recorded and will be put up on YouTube once the event is over. So feel free to ask questions. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, or you can just put them over in the chat. Make sure you're chatting to everyone, not just panelists and hosts, but to everyone. So that way people can see what you're saying. And we do appreciate you coming out. We're joined again by three panelists today. Probably doesn't need a whole lot of introduction, but we'll start with Ron Kennedy. He and his brother Don, of course, are here today, Donnie and Ronnie, and they are the authors of the best-selling South Was Right, but of course they've also produced a number of other books. They're now primarily writing with Shotwell Publishing, which of course has been founded by Clyde Wilson, who is one of the board members of the Abbeville Institute. But they have, I'll tell you a personal story. I actually got involved in doing stuff like this because of the Kennedys. I've said this before. When I was an undergraduate in college, I was in the library kicking around and I saw this book, Why Not Freedom? I thought, that sounds pretty good. I want to look at this. So I read the book, and I was the president of the College Republicans at the time. And I thought, this thing is pretty, and this is amazing. I've never seen anybody write like this before. And it really put me in a whole new path on thinking about the 10th Amendment and other things. So that's when I was probably 21 years old or so, and I ran across Why Not Freedom. But they are prolific writers, great advocates of the South, and of course, the Southern tradition. So we're very happy to have them. And they have a new book out on Reconstruction, which they will talk about today. And then, of course, we have Phil Lee, who has written a wonderful book entitled Southern Reconstruction, which is one of the best books on Reconstruction. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to read the new book by the Kennedys yet because it was lost in the mail. But I had the book on Southern Reconstruction, been out for a little while now, but it is a fantastic book. I recommend it all the time. If you want to get an updated look at Southern Reconstruction, you can go back and, of course, read Coulter or Dunning or some of the great books on the topic. But I think Phil Lee has done a fantastic job on the subject as well. So we're pleased to have all three of them. We're going to do about 15 to 30 minutes for each speaker, and then we'll have a Q&A. So pop those questions in the chat or in the Q&A button so I can get them. And we're going to start with Ronnie Kennedy. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm very honored to be here. Well, my brother, we've been womb mates, and then we've been co-conspirators all our lives. So, but I'm very honored to be with Phil Lee, again, one of my favorite authors. And in my latest book on Reconstruction, I did cite his book on Reconstruction a couple of times, and especially his book on Grant. I've already told him that's my favorite book on Grant, and he's cited with the proper attribution with footnotes. That's the key thing. I love footnotes, not endnotes, because a lot of the things that I say in Reconstruction, destroying a republic and creating an empire, it's a little, well, a lot of people going to say, now, where do you get that? I want them to be able to drop their eyes down to the bottom of the page and see exactly where I got that information. Just make sure, oh, Ron knows what he's talking about. And most of the time I do. Not all the time, but most of the time I do. It's got over 1,200 footnotes, so it's been quite extensively researched, 550 pages, 32 chapters. 15 of those chapters are for each of the southern state that went through the torture chamber of Reconstruction. So that took a lot of time. A lot of times you read and you say, oh, I think Mississippi had it worse. Then you go back and you read what happened in Georgia. And no, I think Georgia had it for. But and Phil's from Florida. I have to tell you, I don't know if Florida's your home state or not, but Florida really surprised me with how much they had to go through. So really all the southern states was put through the torture chamber of Reconstruction. Well, what was the purpose of Reconstruction? Well, it immediately followed Lincoln's War. And over in the book, I'll refer back to the War for Southern Independence as Lincoln's War. And but it followed Lincoln's War, and the Republicans were determined to prevent the South from ever regaining political power within the new country that they were creating. And that's the primary purpose. Now, if you read the postmodernists and the neo-Marxist academicians, they'll tell you that, Reconstruction was a time in which we tried to give civil rights to the Black people. And that is absolutely a falsehood. What they were wanting to do and what they accomplished was the complete destruction of the constitutionally limited republic of sovereign states that was given to us by the founding fathers, and they replaced it with a centralized, supreme, indivisible federal government controlled by northern ruling elites. And today, you can add, in addition to those financial, commercial, and political and social elites of the North, international globalists have now taken over. One of the things I try to point out in the book is, in addition to the fact that Reconstruction never ended, it continues, is that I divide Reconstruction into three phases. Active Reconstruction, which 1866 to 1877, that's active Reconstruction. That's when we had bayonet rule, we had military dictatorship in the southern states. That's when the white South was virtually disenfranchised. You know, if you supported the Confederacy, you weren't allowed to register to vote. And that's when primarily illiterate former slaves were granted the right to vote and put in rulership over the South. That was the time in which the people of the South was really put through the torture chamber. No civil government. Everything was military. Very, very difficult time. And each state had a different way of resisting that. There arose what I call the Southern Resistance Movement. And that Southern Resistance Movement is what overturned the carpetbag regimes and gave us, and this is very important, they gave the Southern people the semblance of self-government. But it wasn't totally self-government. It was government under bogus state governments that were in effect puppet governments. And I can make the comparison. It's very similar to the government that the Nazis instituted in France after they invaded and conquered France. And they gave them a free government, but it was a bogus government. It was a puppet government that had to dance to the tune of Berlin. Now, this term bogus government, calling the state of Louisiana's government a bogus government, or the state of Florida a bogus government, or any other southern states, that upsets some people. But in the Sons of Confederate Veterans, there's one person that we really are familiar with, and that's a fellow called General Stephen D. Lee. Stephen D. Lee in 1899 termed the state governments of the South that was imposed upon the Southern people post-war as bogus governments. That's where I got the term. So it's very important to realize that even though we overcame military dictatorship that was imposed during active Reconstruction, during passive Reconstruction, which goes from 1877 to 1965, and that year 1965 is very important, and I explain that much more in detail, more than I can right now. But passive Reconstruction was a time in which the progressive era, the incorporation of the Bill of Rights into the Constitution, that the federal government could then rule and dominate the state. All these things, the remove or the institution of the income tax, the Federal Reserve, all of these things happened during the Progressive era, which was just a natural continuation of what the radical Republicans did to the United States during Reconstruction. And Donald's going to talk a little bit about how they did that when his turn comes. And I won't tramp on what he's going to say. And I have a feeling Lee will probably have a few things to say about that as well. But the important thing to remember that Reconstruction never ended, and from post 1965, we've been in the era of modern era Reconstruction, the destruction of the tacit North-South reconciliation, and the destruction of the Reconciliation Monument is just emblematic of the fact that yes, we are indeed still under Reconstruction. And really, modern era Reconstruction really validates what Vice President Alexander Stephens said in 1870. He said, "The cause of the South is now the cause of all." Now, was he talking about slavery? Well, if you talk to the liberals, the South fought for slavery. No. He was talking about constitutional government. He was talking about limited government. He was talking about a government where you can't weaponize the federal government against we the people. That was the cause, and we see that today. The fraud and corruption, the criminality that occurred during Reconstruction in the South is now being visited upon places like Detroit, places like New York City, all across Chicago. So we see that modern era Reconstruction is merely a continuation of what the radical Republicans set in place during active Reconstruction. And one of the things that is really, I think, interesting to see is that Reconstruction, we in the South, we like to blame the Yankees for Reconstruction. Well, part of the problem is the fact that the South made 5 strategic errors, strategic failures from the inception of this country till today that allowed Reconstruction to happen initially, and then to continue and to morph into what it is today. And I go over those 5 strategic failures. The first one was in 1787. So Reconstruction didn't stop post-war. The whole circumstances, the environment, the political environment that allowed Reconstruction to occur and continue today was set in place by a strategic failure of the South in 1787, when we refused to listen to the anti-federalists like Patrick Henry, who said, nope, these Northerners have a majority. They will eventually control this new government that you're trying to establish under the Constitution. There may be nothing wrong with the wording of the Constitution, but the characters of the people that we're going into union with, they will usurp this government and use it against the South. But that was a strategic failure. We didn't listen. One Southern anti-federalist said, if we ratify this Constitution, go into this new union, the sun of the South will set, never to rise again. And this was way back in 1787, 1788. Now, the second strategic failure occurred in around the 1850s during the Nashville Convention. We missed a golden opportunity there. I explain that in the book. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right now because of time. The third strategic failure was at Manassas. That was the only military failure. Now, we can have the military authorities argue, but I think the first Manassas was the major strategic failure. We won a great tactical victory, but at the end of the day, we did not follow up like Stonewall Jackson wanted to do, gather what troops we can, and let's follow these retreating Yankees all the way into Washington and dictate the terms of the treaty. and they didn't do it. What was that General Forrest claimed to have said? Put the scare on and keep the scare on. Well, we had the opportunity to keep the scare on during the first battle of Manassas, or as I like to refer to it, the first battle of Yankee Run. But anyway, the opportunity was lost, a major military strategic failure. And now the fourth failure came right after the end of active Reconstruction, when the South decided during passive Reconstruction, a time that Donald and I often refer to as a time when it was cool to be a rebel. Well, in passive Reconstruction, the South proved its patriotism to the country. Our military men worked in every war, is highly decorated. Even the federal government issued stamps honoring Confederate veterans, coins minted in favor of or in honor of Confederate veterans. The military named tanks, the Stuart tank and the Lee tank, after Confederate officers. That was a time when it was cool to be a rebel, but it was passive Reconstruction. The work of the progressives was continuing, especially under FDR. It was continuing, all because the South refused to say, look, we need to make a fundamental change in this government. What the government that came out of Reconstruction is unconstitutional, it's illegitimate. We must make a fundamental change in the government. But the South was, for some good reasons, some bad reasons, did not do that. They merely became the passive South and accepted what was given to us. And as a matter of fact, I think it was John Crow Ransom that in what was it? I'll Take My Stand, when he referred to this era of time when our politicians were given pathetic service to the South. So it was a time in which the South could have done something, but didn't. We did not insist upon a change, a radical change, which allowed the progressives a free hand to continue basically Fabian socialism, getting larger and larger and larger. It was rather interesting doing this research during Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. Many of our enemies, those who hate the South, claimed that the South went to Reconstruction, used violence, which really the violence initially began with the Union League, not the South. And I quote a number of officials who stated as much, some under sworn testimony, that the violence was a result of Union League activity. But a lot of people will say, well, the North really loved the Black brethren. They were trying to help them. They were trying to give them civil rights, and the South wouldn't even let them vote. Well, the North didn't allow Blacks to vote either. A few states, but those states had such a small Black population it made no difference in their elections. Other states absolutely forbade it. But listen to what President Johnson said in December of 1867. This is what the President of the United States said about Black voters. He said, because he was against giving the freed slaves immediate right to vote. And why was it? He said, Blacks had shown, this is quoting the President of the United States now, Blacks had shown less capacity for government than any other race of people. No independent government of any form has ever been successful in their hands. On the contrary, whenever they have been left to their own devices, they have shown a constant tendency to relapse into barbarism. End of quote. So you see that even the federal government, the head of the federal government, was against giving immediate universal franchise to the newly freed slaves. And going back to the very first chapter in my book, I began by trying to put to rest this claim that the South is a racist society, which it was not, and it still is not. And that first chapter is entitled What Could Have Been, a biracial society that could have been. The South, from the very beginning of this country, Patrick Henry was opposed to slavery. He was wanting to find some way to free the slaves. So even in our colonial era, early on, the South was trying to go on the high road of emancipation, something that President Jefferson Davis said when he was in Congress, the high road to emancipation. It's a slow, evolutionary type of movement where people move from a state of servitude to where you train them and make them ready for freedom. This was the effort of the South, but that effort was nullified. It was stopped by the radical abolitionists of the New England school, the John Brown school, who were wanting to create a slave revolt. Well, when you're in a state like Mississippi or South Carolina, where over 50% in some counties of the population are slaves, you're afraid of a Haitian-style slave revolt. So that put a damper on the effort of the South. But nonetheless, we were walking down that road. As a matter of fact, we had a large, very large free Black population in the South. And the free Blacks in New Orleans, for instance, had 50% more property value than the free Blacks in New York. So we were well on our way toward that very acceptable, just, equitable, biracial society, but it was put to a stop by pre-war by the radical abolitionists. Post-war, we still had a grand opportunity to have a peaceful development of a biracial society that both sides could take pride in and both sides could work together in. But that was immediately a problem to the radical Republicans. Now, why was that a problem? You'd think, well, if they love their Black brothers and sisters, they would want that. And this was advocated by the Confederate leadership, the former Confederate leadership. General Beauregard, General Wade Hampton, General Nathan Bedford Forrest, Vice President Alexander Stephens, all, and many, many, many others that I cite, were well in favor of erecting a very fair and workable biracial society, which included civil rights for the free men of the free Blacks, including the right to vote, of course. But if that had happened, guess what? The South would have gained, because now these Black population wouldn't be counted in the census as 3/4 of a person. They'd be counted as any other person. And the South would suddenly end up with, 10 to 12 new representatives in Congress. So the North, the radical Republicans, had fought a war to destroy the political power of the South so they could then control the political power in Washington, D.C. But in so doing, they have actually elevated the political power of the South if they allow the Black and white South to work together to create a fair and equitable biracial society that most likely they would vote along with their white friends and neighbors who they've been friends and neighbors with for generations. And the Democratic Party in the South would ally itself with the Democratic Party in the North. And guess what? The Republican Party would become a minor sectional party, and it would go the same way the old super federal government Federalist Party and Whig Party went. It'd wither away to nothing. And the radical Republicans would not allow that, and they used just a tremendous amount of slander against the South and propaganda against the South in order to convince the North that, yes, we need to hold these people in bondage. We need to make sure these white Southerners never get a chance to control the federal government again. And that's exactly what has happened. So it's really interesting. And again, I want this is Phil. I really didn't plan this, but I also wanted to point out that the bad government in the South during Reconstruction, a black representative from Florida, John Wallace, quite a character. He was one of the ones and there were many of them across the South. Senator Hiram Revels from Mississippi is one of them, would have made a tremendous addition to the Southern political spectrum if we could have worked together. But unfortunately, we couldn't. But this is what he said about the Reconstruction government. He said, and this is John Wallace, a black representative in Florida during Reconstruction. I think he also held office after Reconstruction. A lot of blacks held office after Reconstruction in Mississippi, and Donald might want to cite that when he talks about it. But there's senators and representatives in Mississippi, black representatives who really were well known and well respected in the Mississippi legislature. But this is what John said. John Wallace, Representative Wallace said, a black representative, he said, quote, "The governor of Florida was forced to appoint men as county judges and solicitors, some of whom it was very doubtful as to whether they had ever seen the inside of a law book." And this is the condition that we were in. This is the condition all across the South. He said many carpetbag office holders before they came to the South had been Democrats at the North, but not even respectable cross politicians, yet who now claim to be great men and proper leaders of the colored people of the South. So you can see the attitude of even the black representatives. In another case, quote I have in the book about the Constitutional Convention in, I believe it was in Georgia, in which the newspaper guy from the North said, you know, this whole Constitutional Convention, speaking of the carpetbag Reconstruction state constitution, it's just a circus. It's unbelievable how bad things are. He said, but there are many of the black representatives here who are much better than the white representatives, the carpetbaggers and the scallywags, and who seem to have a much better understanding of what's going to happen to the people back home. So it was rather interesting to note that there were so many blacks who could have worked together with their white friends and neighbors to create a much better society. But what we ended up with was the North used the old technique of empires to control a conquered territory, the technique of divide and rule. So it's very important that we understand that the hatred or the vitriol between the races had its beginning with the Republican Party and their divide and rule scheme to rule over the South. One last thing in closing, I know I've just about run out of time, Brian, but to give you an idea of just how bad things was, the city of Vicksburg, after 5 years of being under carpetbag rule, they started out with a debt of $13,000 in public debt. In 5 years, that went to 1.4 million. That's why they had the Southern resistance movement in Mississippi, especially there in Vicksburg, where the whites and the property owning blacks got together. And this was the thing, this was not a white only. The property owners of the black property owners were suffering under this exorbitant taxation as well as the white. They band together and they were led by some Union officers of all things, and they took over the courthouse there in Vicksburg and forced the mayor to leave, and they was able to install respectable, legitimate government, a government based upon the consent of the governed. Brian, have I used up my time?
I think so. You're right at the end there. That was a great presentation. Thank you very much. And we appreciate you coming on. And of course, we'll have questions for you. I know there's already some popping up. Again, just to remind people, if you have questions, hit that Q&A button at the bottom or use the chat. I had the chat disabled accidentally at the beginning, but you can use it now. So put those questions over to there, and I'll moderate the Q&A after all three speakers have presented. So again, Ronnie, thank you very much. And to go out and buy his book, his new book on Reconstruction. Do you have a picture of it? A book right next to you can hold up for everybody to see?
I just happen to have one. What? That's Lee's book. I don't want to hold his up. Let me get mine up. He can hold his up. I don't know if you can see that. It's Reconstruction.
There we go.
Destroying the Republic and Creating an Empire.
So that's published by Shotwell Publishing.
Shotwell.
And it's on anywhere you can buy books online, you can get it. Of course, bookstores are pretty much non-existent anymore unless you can find a Barnes & Noble or Books A Million, but they're even cutting down the amount of space they have for books. So you're going to have to get it online, but it's a great book. I'm sure it's a great book. I haven't read it yet because I don't have a copy yet, but I will. So thank you, Ronnie. And we're going to turn it over to Phil. In fact, I'm going to make him the host for a little while so he can share a PowerPoint presentation with you. So if there's any kind of technical issues here, just bear with us as we're getting this going. But Phil, I'm going to make you the host right now, and you can share your screen after you do that, and then start your presentation. Okay.
Southern Reconstruction. I'm going to talk about four things. Black emancipation. What are the legacies of Reconstruction? Black emancipation is one legacy. Second is Southern poverty. Third is reparations, but they're already paid. And fourth is Republican Party hegemony for 70 years after the Civil War. So looking at Black emancipation, I'm showing now a photo of 1938 Black sharecroppers. And that's 73 years after the end of the Civil War. I think you can imagine what they look like. And my next slide is a picture of 1938 white sharecroppers, and they look worse. They are in desperate poverty, but there's really almost no difference between the Black sharecroppers and the white sharecroppers in 1938 in terms of economic status. Now, the whites had an advantage in social status, but that doesn't feed anybody. So the next slide is, okay, what are the statistics on poverty during the Reconstruction era? Well, in 1860, and this is according to William Cooper in his American South, A History, Volume 2. What I got here on this slide shows a picture of the per capita income in the United States by region: Northeast, North Central, South, and West. And in 1860, the annual per capita income in the South was at the 72nd percentile. In other words, it's below average. In the Northeast, it was at 139%, almost twice as much as in the South. That was in 1860. 90 years later, it took that long for the South to recover from the 72nd percentile. In 1850, it finally got back to the 73rd percentile. 90 years, and they're still below average, but at least they got back to where they started. All that period in between, they were way below average. So what is a longer lasting legacy of the Civil War than segregation and de jure segregation is Southern poverty, Black and white. So Well, what caused this poverty? What caused the principal cause of the poverty was the tax and spending structure of the federal government. From in 1860, the tariff, which was the principal source of tax revenue, was at 19% on dutiable items. For the 50 years after the Civil War, the tariff on dutiable items was between about 45 to 50%, probably average 45. Then the Depression came along and we began to see tariffs come down. It went to 33% from 1935 to 1944. And then from 45 to 1954, they dropped to 16%. So tariffs, which had been set at about 45% for 50 years after the Civil War, all of a sudden they start coming down. And after 1945, they dropped to 16%. The reason for that is that in 1945, the economies of Europe had been wrecked. The economies of Asia had been wrecked. There was only one store in town if you wanted to buy any manufactured goods, and that was the industrial economy north of the Mason-Dixon line and the Ohio River. All of a sudden, these guys understood that if there's not going to be anybody competing with us, let's get everybody to reduce their tariffs so they can buy more of us. That we're the only store in town. That shows you kind of how long this lasted. So a lot of people, it's to understand how tariffs affect the Southern economy. I'm going to break this down simply. About $300 million worth of cotton was sold every year to Europe. So let's assume that Britain sends one giant fleet of $300 million worth of manufactured goods to the United States. One giant fleet. That fleet arrives, and if there's no tariff, they collect $300 million by selling us those goods. They take that $300 million and they buy Southern cotton and other exports. So with no tariff, $300 million, they collect $300 million when they sell their goods, enabling them to buy $300 million of cotton when they go out. Now, if there's a 45% import tariff, as there was for 45 years after the Civil War, a 45% import tariff, they ship the $300 million in goods to the United States. Uncle Sam takes $135 million, which is 45%. That leaves the Europeans who have shipped their $300 million worth of goods over here. They don't have $300 million of dollars anymore to buy cotton. They've only got $165 million. You can see that it reduces their buying power for U.S. exports by almost 50%. It reduces it by 45%. And that's a big number. That's my point. A lot of people don't get, they miss that part of the analysis of what the impact of tariffs really is. And I think, Brian, one of your favorite statesmen, put it very well before the Civil War, and that was Calhoun. We export to import. We export to import. He was right about that. Now, as we go on, I want to take a look at what some of the spending was like after the Civil War. The South is impoverished. For 25 years after the Civil War, over half of the federal budget went to three items, which was of no benefit whatsoever to any former Confederate or descendant of the Confederate. I'll give you the three items. Number one, well, they're not necessarily in order, but I'll tell you the three. Number one was the Union veterans' pensions. For 25 years after the Civil War, and this continued on beyond that, it was about $1.2 billion. No Confederates benefited from that. Here's another budget item of the federal government. Interest on the federal debt. That was twice as much as the Union veterans' pensions, but that debt was only Union debt. None of it was Confederate debt. It was Union debt. And then the third item was the budget surpluses, which were about 1.7 billion. So those three things: pensions, federal debt, and budget surpluses. So you're going, budget surpluses. Well, that's really interesting. When have we ever had that? And how could it be a big item? Well, they had budget surpluses because the United States built up a bunch of war debt during the Civil War. And in those days, they paid off their war debt, unlike now. But the point is that those are reparations. The Southerners that paid that money for their share of those taxes were paying reparations. We just didn't call them that. And I have a chart here you can't see because I didn't know how to get it into this Zoom presentation. But the point is, the last Union veterans pension was paid in 2020 in June. And the reason that happened, the reason it took so long is because gradually what they did was, like they did with almost all federal programs, they gradually relaxed the standard. So, first it would be, it would be only for people that were wounded in battle. Then it would be, well, for any soldier that was wounded in the service. They kept liberalizing the standards until they finally got to, any descendant that had some sort of relation. But anyway, the last one was paid in 2020. And over $8 billion in these Union veterans pensions. And it had a pernicious effect because there were a lot of, during the late 18th century, 19th century, there were a lot of Union veterans. So it had the effect of, they wanted these pensions. It was kind of like the student loan forgiveness now. They wanted these pensions, and the northern congressmen and politicians said, well, if you want the pensions, we got to raise some money. Well, go ahead. Well, a good place to raise money is on tariffs to protect our industries up here up in the north. So it was a cycle, a destructive cycle of. It was like the college the college loan forgiveness. The Union veterans were being bribed to support high tariffs, and that's one reason there was high tariffs. And of course, the manufacturers are all for it. Well, we're happy to have high tariffs to keep the European competition out of the United States. So I've already said that the last pension was paid in 2020. So I guess I shouldn't have repeated that. But this is a much bigger issue than a lot of people appreciate. Now, the next slide I have, you might enjoy this, Ron, it's a slide that shows the pro forma, what would happen if the South went back into the United States by replacing their senators and congressmen one for what they were in 1860. Well, the Senate in 1865, there were 40 Republicans and Democrats. In the House, there were 111 Republicans and 72 Democrats. If you just brought the South back in without penalizing them for the 2/3 rule, that the one third of the blacks being taken out, the Senate would have been 40 to 32 instead of 40 to 10, and the House would have been 111 to 143 instead of 111 to 72. Now the significance of that is that with that change, the Republican Party loses its veto power. No veto power for the Congress, and that would have radically changed the Reconstruction. It's clear that though they were just like today's politicians. Well, we want immigrants to come in across our border because we're all of us are immigrants, and we want people to live the American dream. Oh yeah, it just so happens they vote Democrat, but that's not the real reason we want them in. No, we want them in because we want people to live the American dream, and we want to be able to ship them to the states where we want their votes. So this is what we're seeing today is just a repeat of what we saw before. Now I've got two slides I'd like to conclude with. One is I wrote a book about President Grant's presidency, and until recently, he was the worst president of the country, but he's not, somebody's beating, and it could get worse. Okay.
Amen.
This one is also published by Shotwell, but the sales have been picking up. My first book on Reconstruction was, I think, in 2017, called Southern Reconstruction. And I was really inspired by that. I don't know, I had some kind of a muse that was helping me, because it's one of my best books, that wasn't the hardest to write, because I really wanted that story to be told. But so I recommend Southern Reconstruction by Philip Lee, and then also U.S. Grant's Failed Presidency, which should be treated as a companion volume there. So I'm sorry that we couldn't get the slides up. It would have been better that way, and I'm sorry that we took that I had to take the time, or that to fiddle around. And I trust that didn't bore you too much. But I'm done. I'm ready to turn it over.
All right, just go ahead and make me the host again, and
okay, let me get rid of my slide. I'm going to make you a host.
All right. Thank you very much, Phil. And so we're to Donnie. Now, Donnie's got a little connectivity issue here with his video, so it might be more audio than video, just to let everybody know, but we can hear his audio just fine, but he might go in and out a little bit on the video. So, Donnie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. And Phil, that was a great presentation. I'm sorry you had that difficulty, but that happens to all of us. These Yankee gadgets just don't want to always work for us. Thank y'all all for being here. Listen, I really want to remind people that Reconstruction is going on now. I mean, you think about it. We weaponize the federal government against political opponents. We jail people for speaking out. We censor people. I mean the federal government. Well, they actually try to impeach a sitting president because they didn't like the way he sounded and acted. This could have happened in 1866. We know it's going on today. So Reconstruction has never ended. It has just morphed into a different time and a different place. And it's really interesting. I want to go back to the beginning here and remind folks that the government we have today is not the government that our founding fathers gave us. I like to remind people that when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, that was a death knell for the Roman Republic. Rome never rose as a republic after that, but it did become a powerful and tyrannical empire. Abraham Lincoln took this country across the figurative Rubicon when the federal government, when the United States invaded, conquered, and oppressed the Confederate States of America and the citizens thereof. We are not even close to the same nation that our founding fathers gave us. Today, we are a different nation. And I want to talk about how that happened, because that was actually a revolution. And interesting enough, a lot of our people that we look to and ask for opinions on Reconstruction, they also referred to Reconstruction as a revolution. One of the individuals that I really enjoy reading and studying was Claude Bowers in his Tragic Era, written, I think, somewhere around 1920s, 1930s. And in the Tragic Era, listen to what Claude Bowers said, quote, "The story of this revolution is one of desperate enterprises by daring and unscrupulous men. The evil that they did lives after them." Now, that's an important point that we need to all remember. The evil they did lives on today. That is why I keep saying Reconstruction continues even to this day. It's still going on. Dr. Van Doren, who did a well-known artist and author back in the 1920s, did a review of Claude Bowers' book, And in his review, he stated that Bowers, quote, engaged in explaining why and how this revolution came about. That was in 1929 that he said that. Now, here's a really interesting statement. When you think about Reconstruction and when you think about revolution and the revolutionary change in these United States because of war, the invasion, conquest, and Reconstruction, listen to what James S. Allen had to say. Now, Allen was a member of the Communist Party USA. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist. And this is what he said, quote, Reconstruction was the continuation of the Civil War into a new phase in which the revolution passed from the stage of armed conflict into primarily a political struggle which sought to consolidate the Northern triumph, end quote, end quote. Reconstruction really was sealing the deal for the Yankee Empire. It was sealing the deal of the destruction of the original constitutional republic given to us by our founding fathers. That republic is just as dead as the Roman Republic was when Caesar took his troops across the Rubicon. So therein lies the major difference between us today and then. A revolution has taken place. Now, that revolution didn't just come about accidentally. There was a reason it happened. In a letter to Yankee General Frederick Joseph Wiedemeyer, Frederick Engels had this to say. Now, Joseph Wiedemeyer was a member of the Communist Party of London, along with Marx and Engels, before he came to the U.S. and later became a United States general in the war. When Lincoln declared war on the South, of course, all the radical socialists and communists in the country at that time, 99.9% of whom were in the North, they all joined in this effort. But Engels and Wiedemeyer were good friends, close compatriots. And Engels, about halfway through the war, sent a letter to his communist buddy in the Union Army, General Joseph Wiedemeyer, and said, quote, the preliminaries of the proletarian revolution, the measures that prepares and clears the way for us, i.e. communists, all that is now taken for granted. Do you understand what he's saying? That war and later on Reconstruction sealed the deal for destroying that system of government that stood in the way of the promotion of the, quote, proletarian, i.e. the communist revolution. In another letter, Engels stated, quote, and this is Frederick Engels, he said that the defeat of the South, quote, doubtless determines the future of America for hundreds of years to come. Did y'all hear what he said? This is Frederick Engels talking. This is Karl Marx's bosom buddy. This is the co-author of Modern Day Communism. And he says that the defeat of the South, Reconstruction, all of that would doubtless determine the future of America for hundreds of years to come. And he was not bemoaning that fact. He was celebrating that fact. Now, when I tell people that a lot, often they'll say, well, now, why do you think that is the case? Well, it's very simple. Marxists, socialists, big government people, they do not like power close to the people. What did we have? What did our founding fathers give us when they gave us first the Articles of Confederation and then the Constitution? They gave us a system of government where we, the people of sovereign states, rule the government. The government did not rule us. Now, that is a marvelous thing. There's no way you can foster a communist tyrannical government on a nation when you have people that can nullify the action of the central government that's trying to go communist. And that is why they needed the South out of the way. Now, what they were trying to create was not a republic of sovereign state, but one nation indivisible. Now, that is an interesting statement. In 1848, at the behest of the Communist Party of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Communist Party asked Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, give us a list of items that we need to do to promote communism in the Federal Republic of Germany. They sent back, Marx and Engels sent them back a list of 17 items. 17 items. Number one on that list of things to be done to convert the Federal Republic of Germany into a tyrannical socialist and then communist nation was to promote the concept of Germany as, quote, one nation indivisible, end quote. Now think about that. That is what they wanted. They wanted to get rid of real states' rights. They wanted to whether it's in Germany or in the U.S., they need one nation, indivisible, one strong, powerful nation. And that is what they got when they finished up with the fraudulently enacted 14th Amendment. That just sealed the deal. The war pretty well destroyed the Constitution, but the deal was sealed with the fraudulently adopted 14th Amendment. And I'll never say that amendment was adopted. It was fraudulently imposed upon the people of America. And the interesting thing to me is that nowadays that imposition is upon all of us. Ron mentioned Alexander Stephens, Vice President Alexander Stephens, in his great 2-volume work on the constitutional history of the war between the states. He clearly states that eventually all of Americans would realize that the cause of the South is the cause of all, because it is the cause of limited government, of free government, of we the people running the government and not the government running us. Now, let's look at the 14th Amendment, which I think is the keystone of the Reconstruction era of work and the work of destroying, eventually putting the death nail upon the constitutional republic as established. In 1866, there were 37 states in the Union at that time. The South had already been compelled to go back in the Union, exit the idea of government by the consent of the governed. 28 states were needed to ratify an amendment to the Constitution. When the 14th Amendment was offered to the American people, there were 28 states that said, yes, we'll go with this. 22 states that said, yes, we'll go with it. 12 said no. 3 were not counted. One of those 3 was Mississippi. It was late in getting its vote there, but it had voted no also. So you see, they did not have enough. The Yankees didn't have enough representative in Congress to pass the 14th Amendment. So rather than be defeated, what did they do? Well, they went back and expelled all the southern states from Congress, which is kind of a funny thing. They threw us out of a government that we didn't want to be part of to begin with. But nevertheless, they threw us out. They banished large number of Southern white voters. If you had any connection with the Confederacy, you were not allowed to vote. They enforced voting of illiterate voters who had no experience in the democratic process. Now, this is something I think Ron and maybe Phil, I'm sure, I think I heard Ron talk about this earlier. This is something that for the vast majority of states in the North, they denied this. They would not allow these people to vote, but yet they insisted that they must vote in the South. Now, I look back at the words of Nathan Bedford Forrest when he was, after the war, he was speaking to a group of Black people, and many of them were voters, and he encouraged them to become educated, educate yourself, and then become voters and do like we all do, vote for the best man. Actually, Nathan Bedford Forrest was a civil rights leader. He believed in education and then voting. But he wanted people to be educated. He didn't want them just to come across the border or how to be able to speak and not being part of the community and start voting like some of our politicians seem to want to do with these illegal immigrants. Nathan Bedford Forrest and most of the South desired that the Black population be trained by education and experience to become qualified voters. So, but this was not allowed. That was what Ron and I in our book on Jefferson Davis we referred to as the high road to emancipation, that Jefferson Davis and so many of the Southern leaders desired to promote. But of course, Abraham Lincoln and his group had no compulsion with taking care of, no desire to take care of the Black people. All they wanted was power. As a matter of fact, one person asked Lincoln, I think it was in 65, before he was mercifully relieved of his problem as being president, what about the Black people? How are they going to fare? And he just simply said, well, let them root hog or die. And that seems to be the attitude of most of the people up north. I think in Punished with Poverty, Ron and I demonstrate our show where Northerners and Europeans who came to this country noticed that the prejudice of color was much greater in the North than it was in the South. And throughout Punished with Poverty, we point out that there was a warm, almost community relationship between Black and white people in the South. As a matter of fact, by 1860, there was no such thing as African Americans. Today, there's no such thing as African American. Well, maybe Elon Musk, he's an African American. He came from Africa. But unless they came from Haiti or somewhere else, there are no African Americans because they're more American than they are African. I'm a Scottish American, but I don't go around saying I'm a Scottish American. I'm an American with Scottish lineage. Also, the Black population, they are Americans with African lineage. In 1860, these Southern Blacks were much more, this was their home. And if you'll read in the slave narrative, you'll find where more than one slave would report that they would as soon as raise their hand against their own self as they would against their white friends and white neighbors. Now, every time I say that, I have some liberal nut saying, oh, you're just defending slavery. I am not saying that the African American liked slavery. What I am saying is they were more American than African. They were Christian, more Christian than pagan, and they had love for their neighbors. They'd rather live in peace with their white friends and neighbors. And that was something that, unfortunately, Reconstruction pretty well destroyed. That's quite ridiculous. Now, here's an interesting thing is that in order to get this amendment passed, the 14th Amendment, the Yankee government declared that the only way the Southern states could get back into the Union, that one that they didn't want to be part of anyway, but the one that they were forced back in until they wouldn't vote for the 14th Amendment, and then they were kicked out. Little aside here, always remember, the 13th Amendment was ratified by the same states that rejected the 14th Amendment. Now think about that. If they were qualified enough to pass the 13th Amendment, which eradicated slavery in the U.S., then why were they not capable of ratifying the 14th Amendment? So that's something to think about. But always remember that they could pass, they did ratify, the Southern states ratified the 13th, but refused to ratify the 14th. Now here is why. And again, we've all pointed this out, everybody on this panel, the war wasn't about slavery. Yes, it was an issue, but it wasn't the issue. The issue was, how are we to be governed? Is it we, the people, the sovereign states who run this nation? Or is the federal bureaucrats the one that runs this nation, the politicians? Which one is it? So that's the main issue. The 13th Amendment got rid of slavery. It did not change the nature of the federal government. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Southerners, fellow Americans, please realize that this 14th Amendment fraudulently hacked to the Constitution. It's illegal, unjust. That article, that amendment totally turned that Constitution upside down. Where once the federal government feared what we, the people of the states, would do to it, now we, the people of the states, fear what the federal government will do to us. So all of that has changed and was done through the fraudulent action of the federal government. Now, right quick, and I'm going to go over this right quickly, and I'm going to throw it back to Brian here. But I would like to remind folks, it wasn't just Southerners who were suffering under this even back then. The state of New Jersey, in its resolution number 1, it condemned the action of the federal Congress. Not only did they say that the southern states were kicked out of Congress illegally, but some of their representatives also were kicked out because they were opposed to this amendment. In Oregon, same thing. In Oregon, when the state legislature was ready to vote on the 14th Amendment, they didn't have enough. The radicals didn't have enough votes to pass. So what they did, they kidnapped 2 representatives who were opposed to the amendment, and they replaced them with people who were not elected. And those people voted for the amendment, and it passed. The 14th Amendment, Constitutional Amendment, passed in Oregon very narrowly. And Oregon, as well as New Jersey, rescinded its ratification because of this. They said that's not correct. Many people had said, including people from Ohio, Oregon, that this forced enactment was unconstitutional. Forrest McDonald, he also, in one of his articles, he noted that this constitutional amendment was totally illegal. Now, just in case you're thinking maybe you and I and Ron and Phil are the only ones who think like this and we dreamed this up in the last 20, 30 years, in 1957, David Lawrence wrote an editorial in I think it was U.S. News and World Report, in which he totally destroys the 14th Amendment as being a legitimate part of the Constitution. That journal was that article was repeated in 1970, and David Lawrence, in the conclusion of his article, he said of the 14th Amendment was the worst scandal in our history. No such amendment was ever legally ratified. Now, that's in 1957 and 1970. I think we all understand that it was illegal. And to add icing to the cake, Senator Doolittle from Wisconsin, when it became obvious that the South would not go along with this 14th Amendment that they needed so terribly, he had this to say about the Southerners. He said, quote, "We will march upon them and force them to adopt it," the 14th Amendment, "at the point of the bayonet." So in other words, it is at the point of the bayonet that he is willing to force Americans, his fellow Americans, to adopt a system of government beyond their consent. When he said this, at the point of a bayonet, I am reminded of the Queen of Hawaii. In her book, she refers to the bayonet constitution that the Yankees forced upon the citizens of Hawaii against their will. So this idea of forcing people to adopt a government against their will, it is diametrically opposed to what our founding fathers outlined for us in the Declaration of Independence. So this book that Ron wrote, which I am really thrilled to be just a little part of, Reconstruction, Destroying the Republic and Creating an Empire, it nails it down. We have an empire now, not a republic of sovereign states. Robert E. Lee was right. In a letter to Lord Acton asked Robert E. Lee, General Lee, what's going to become of America now that real states' rights are no more? And General Lee, in essence, said that this country would become, quote, aggressive abroad and despotic at home. Today, the U.S. government has more military bases than probably the British and Roman governments combined ever had. Today, you see all kind of tyrannical actions. Oh, there was just a lady that was running for president a couple of years ago, was on national TV advocating that somebody be in charge of disinformation and shutting down all these people who are spreading disinformation. Now, who do you think that she is going to allow to be the judge of what is and is not disinformation? I guarantee you Brian McClanahan won't make it 5 minutes in her worldview. So we have a lot to do. Reconstruction continues today, but we can be victorious if we work together. So Brian, I'm going to pass it back to you. Thank you, sir, for allowing me.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming out and spending your couple hours on your Friday with us. And I know, and thank you all the guests for coming out. We had a lot of people sign up to hear this. So again, we appreciate your support and your time. And we'll be doing another one in October. So keep on the lookout for that. But we're going to wrap this up. So thank you all for coming out, and everybody have a good weekend.